Book 1, Chapter 11, of Resurrection. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud, read by David Barnes. Book 1, Chapter 11. The Trial, Maslova cross-examined. When the reading of the indictment was over, the President, after having consulted the members, turned to Kartinkin with an expression that plainly said, "Now we shall find out the whole truth down to the minutest detail." "Peasant Simeon Kartinkin," he said, stooping to the left. Simeon Kartinkin got up, stretched his arms down his sides, and leaning forward with his whole body, continued moving his cheeks inaudibly. "You are accused of having, on the 17th of January, 1880, together with Euphemia Bochkova and Katerina Maslova, stolen money from a portmanteau belonging to the merchant Smelkov, and then, having procured some arsenic, persuaded Katerina Maslova to give it to the merchant Smelkov in a glass of brandy, which was the cause of Smelkov's death. Do you plead guilty?" said the President, stooping to the right. "Not nohow, because our business is to attend to the lodgers, and—" "You'll tell us that afterwards. Do you plead guilty?" "Oh, no, sir, I only—" "You'll tell us that afterwards. Do you plead guilty?" quietly and firmly asked the President. "Can't do such a thing, because that—" The usher again rushed up to Simeon Kartinkin and stopped him in a tragic whisper. The President moved the hand with which he held the paper, and placed the elbow in a different position, with an air that said, "This is finished," and turned to Euphemia Bochkova. "Euphemia Bochkova, you are accused of having, on the 17th of January, 1880, in the lodging-house Mauritania, together with Simeon Kartinkin and Katerina Maslova, stolen some money and a ring out of the merchant Smelkov's portmanteau, and having shared the money among yourselves, given poison to the merchant Smelkov, thereby causing his death. Do you plead guilty?" "I am not guilty of anything," boldly and firmly replied the prisoner. "I never went near the room, but when this baggage went in, she did the whole business." "You will say all this afterwards," the President again said, quietly and firmly. "So do you not plead guilty?" "I did not take the money, nor give the drink, nor go into the room. Had I gone in, I should have kicked her out." "So you do not plead guilty?" "Never." "Very well." "Katerina Maslova," the President began, turning to the third prisoner, "you are accused of having come from the brothel with the key of the merchant Smelkov's portmanteau, money and a ring." He said all this like a lesson learnt by heart, leaning towards the member on his left, who was whispering into his ear that a bottle, mentioned in the list of the material evidence, was missing. "Of having stolen out of the portmanteau money and a ring," he repeated, "and shared it. Then, returning to the lodging-house Mauritania with Smelkov, of giving him poison in his drink and thereby causing his death. Do you plead guilty?" "I'm not guilty of anything," she began rapidly. "As I said before, I say again, I did not take it. I did not take it. I did not take anything, and the ring he gave me himself." "You do not plead guilty of having stolen 2,500 roubles?" asked the President. "I've said I took nothing but the 40 roubles." "Well, and do you plead guilty of having given the merchant Smelkov a powder in his drink?" "Yes, that I did, only I believed what they told me, that they were sleeping powders, and that no harm could come of them. I never thought and never wished— God is my witness, I say I never meant this," she said. "So you do not plead guilty of having stolen the money and the ring from the merchant Smelkov, but confess that you gave him the powder?" said the President. "Well, yes, I do confess this, but I thought they were sleeping powders. I only gave them to make him sleep. I never meant and never thought of worse." "Very well," said the President, evidently satisfied with the results gained. "Now, tell us how it all happened." And he leaned back in his chair and put his folded hands on the table. "Tell us all about it. A free and full confession will be to your advantage." Maslova continued to look at the President in silence and blushing. "Tell us how it happened." "How it happened?" Maslova suddenly began, speaking quickly. I came to the lodging-house and was shown into the room. He was there, already very drunk." She pronounced the word he, with a look of horror in her wide-open eyes. "I wished to go away, but he would not let me." She stopped, as if having lost the thread, or remembered something else. "Well, and then?" "Well, what then? I remained a bit, and went home again." At this moment the public prosecutor raised himself a little, leaning on one elbow in an awkward manner. "You would like to put a question?" said the President, and having received an answer in the affirmative, he made a gesture inviting the public prosecutor to speak. "I want to ask, was the prisoner previously acquainted with Simeon Kartinkin?" said the public prosecutor, without looking at Maslova, and having put the question, he compressed his lips and frowned. The President repeated the question. Maslova stared at the public prosecutor with a frightened look. "With Simeon?" "Yes," she said. "I should like to know what the prisoner's acquaintance with Kartinkin consisted in. Did they meet often?" "Consisted in? He invited me for the lodgers. It was not an acquaintance at all," answered Maslova, anxiously moving her eyes from the President to the public prosecutor and back to the President. "I should like to know why Kartinkin invited only Maslova and none of the other girls for the lodgers," said the public prosecutor, with half-closed eyes and a cunning Mephistophelian smile. "I don't know. How should I know?" said Maslova, casting a frightened look around and fixing her eyes for a moment on Nekhludoff. "He asked whom he liked." "Is it possible that she has recognized me?" thought Nekhludoff, and the blood rushed to his face. But Maslova turned away without distinguishing him from the others, and again fixed her eyes anxiously on the public prosecutor. "So the prisoner denies having had any intimate relations with Kartinkin. Very well. I have no more questions to ask." And the public prosecutor took his elbow off the desk and began writing something. He was not really noting anything down, but only going over the letters of his notes with a pen, having seen the procurer and leading advocates, after putting a clever question, make a note with which later on to annihilate their adversaries. The President did not continue at once, because he was consulting the member with the spectacles, whether he was agreed that the questions, which had all been prepared beforehand and written out, should be put. "Well, what happened next?" he then went on. "I came home," looking a little more boldly only at the President, "and went to bed. Hardly had I fallen asleep when one of the girls, Bertha, woke me. 'Go, your merchant has come again. He,' she again uttered the word he with evident horror, "he kept treating our girls and then wanting to send for more wine, but his money was all gone, and he sent me to his lodgings and told me where the money was and how much to take. So I went." The President was whispering to the member on his left, but, in order to appear as if he had heard, he repeated her last words. "So you went? Well, what next?" "I went and did all he told me, went into his room. I did not go alone, but called Simeon Kartinkin and her," she said, pointing to Botchkova. "That's a lie! I never went in," Botchkova began, but was stopped. "In their presence I took out 4 notes," continued Maslova, frowning, without looking at Botchkova. "Yes, but did the prisoner notice," again asked the prosecutor, "how much money there was when she was getting out the 40 roubles?" Maslova shuddered when the prosecutor addressed her. She did not know why it was, but she felt that he wished her evil. "I did not count it, but only saw some 100-rouble notes." "Ah, the prisoner saw 100-rouble notes. That's all?" "Well, so you brought back the money," continued the President, looking at the clock. "I did." "Well, and then?" "Then he took me back with him," said Maslova. "Well, and how did you give him the powder? In his drink?" "How did I give it? I put them in and gave it to him." "Why did you give it him?" She did not answer, but sighed deeply and heavily. "He would not let me go," she said, after a moment's silence, "and I was quite tired out, and so I went out into the passage and said to Simeon, 'If he would only let me go, I'm so tired.' And he said, We're all so sick of him, we were thinking of giving him a sleeping draught. He'll fall asleep, and then you can go." So I said all right. I thought they were harmless, and he gave me the packet. I went in. He was lying behind the partition, and at once called for brandy. I took a bottle of fine champagne from the table, poured out 2 glasses, one for him and one for myself, and put the powders into his glass, and gave it him. Had I known, how could I have given them to him?" "Well, and how did the ring come into your possession?" asked the President. "When did he give it you?" "That was when we came back to his lodgings. I wanted to go away, and he gave me a knock on the head and broke my comb. I got angry and said I'd go away, and he took the ring off his finger and gave it to me, so that I should not go," she said. Then the public prosecutor again slightly raised himself, and putting on an air of simplicity, asked permission to put a few more questions, and having received it, bending his head over his embroidered collar, he said, "I should like to know how long the prisoner remained in the merchant Smelkoff's room." Maslova again seemed frightened, and she again looked anxiously from the public prosecutor to the President, and said hurriedly, "I do not remember how long." "Yes, but does the prisoner remember if she went anywhere else in the lodging-house after she left Smelkoff?" Maslova considered for a moment. "Yes, I did go into an empty room next to his." "Yes, and why did you go in?" asked the public prosecutor, forgetting himself and addressing her directly. "I went in to rest a bit, and to wait for an izvozchik." "And was Kartinkin in the room with the prisoner or not?" "He came in." "Why did he come in?" "There was some of the merchant's brandy left, and we finished it together." "Ah, finished it together. Very well. And did the prisoner talk to Kartinkin, and if so, what about?" Maslova suddenly frowned, blushed very red, and said hurriedly, "What about? I didn't talk about anything, and that's all I know. Do what you like with me. I'm not guilty, and that's all." "I have nothing more to ask," said the prosecutor, and drawing up his shoulders in an unnatural manner, began writing down as the prisoner's own evidence in the notes for his speech that she had been in the empty room with Kartinkin. There was a short silence. "You have nothing more to say?" "I have told you everything," she said with a sigh, and sat down. Then the President noted something down, and, having listened to something that the member on his left whispered to him, he announced a 10-minutes interval, rose hurriedly, and left the court. The communication he had received from the tall, bearded member with the kindly eyes was that the member, having felt a slight stomach derangement, wished to do a little massage and to take some drops, and this was why an interval was made. When the judges had risen, the advocates, the jury, and the witnesses also rose, with the pleasant feeling that part of the business was finished, and began moving in different directions. Nekhludoff went into the jury's room and sat down by the window. End of Book 1, Chapter 11. Book 1, Chapter 12, of Resurrection. Yes, this was Katusha. The relations between Nekhludoff and Katusha had been the following. Nekhludoff first saw Katusha when he was a student in his 3rd year at the university, and was preparing an essay on land tenure during the summer vacation, which he passed with his aunts. Until then he had always lived in summer with his mother and sister on his mother's large estate near Moscow, but that year his sister had married, and his mother had gone abroad to a watering place, and he, having his essay to write, resolved to spend the summer with his aunts. It was very quiet in their secluded estate, and there was nothing to distract his mind. His aunts loved their nephew and heir very tenderly, and he, too, was fond of them and of their simple, old-fashioned life. During that summer, on his aunt's estate, Nekhludoff passed through that blissful state of existence when a young man, for the first time, without guidance from anyone outside, realizes all the beauty and significance of life, and the importance of the task allotted in it to man, when he grasps the possibility of unlimited advance towards perfection for oneself and for all the world, and gives himself to this task not only hopefully, but with full conviction of attaining to the perfection he imagines. In that year, while still at the university, he had read Spencer's Social Statics, and Spencer's views on landholding especially impressed him, as he himself was heir to large estates. His father had not been rich, but his mother had received 10,000 acres of land for her dowry. At that time he fully realized all the cruelty and injustice of private property in land, and being one of those to whom a sacrifice to the demands of conscience gives the highest spiritual enjoyment, he decided not to retain property rights, but to give up to the peasant labourers the land he had inherited from his father. It was on this land question he wrote his essay. He arranged his life on his aunt's estate in the following manner. He got up very early, sometimes at 3 o'clock, and before sunrise went through the morning mists to bathe in the river under the hill. He returned while the dew still lay on the grass and the flowers. Sometimes, having finished his coffee, he sat down with his books of reference and his papers to write his essay. But very often, instead of reading or writing, he left home again, and wandered through the fields and the woods. Before dinner he lay down and slept somewhere in the garden. At dinner he amused and entertained his aunts with his bright spirits. Then he rode on horseback or went for a row on the river, and in the evening he again worked at his essay, or sat reading or playing patience with his aunts. His joy in life was so great that it agitated him and kept him awake many a night, especially when it was moonlight, so that instead of sleeping he wandered about in the garden till dawn, alone with his dreams and fancies. And so, peacefully and happily, he lived through the first month of his stay with his aunts, taking no particular notice of their half-ward, half-servant, the black-eyed, quick-footed Katusha. Then, at the age of 19, Nekhludoff, brought up under his mother's wing, was still quite pure. If a woman figured in his dreams at all, it was only as a wife. All the other women who, according to his ideas, he could not marry, were not women for him, but human beings. But on Ascension Day that summer, a neighbour of his aunt's and her family, consisting of 2 young daughters, a schoolboy, and a young artist of peasant origin who was staying with them, came to spend the day. After tea they all went to play in the meadow in front of the house, where the grass had already been mown. They played at the game of Gorelki, and Katusha joined them. Running about and changing partners several times, Nekhludoff caught Katusha, and she became his partner. Up to this time he had liked Katusha's looks, but the possibility of any nearer relations with her had never entered his mind. "Impossible to catch those 2, said the merry young artist, whose turn it was to catch, and who could run very fast with his short, muscular legs. "You, and not catch us," said Katusha. 1, 2, 3, and the artist clapped his hands. Katusha, hardly restraining her laughter, changed places with Nekhludoff, behind the artist's back, and pressed his large hand with her little rough one, and rustling with her starched petticoat, ran to the left. Nekhludoff ran fast to the right, trying to escape from the artist, but when he looked round he saw the artist running after Katusha, who kept well ahead, her firm young legs moving rapidly. There was a lilac bush in front of them, and Katusha made a sign with her head to Nekhludoff to join her behind it, for if they once clasped hands again they were safe from their pursuer, that being the rule of the game. He understood the sign, and ran behind the bush, but he did not know that there was a small ditch overgrown with nettles there. He stumbled and fell into the nettles, already wet with dew, stinging his hands, but rose immediately, laughing at his mishap. Katusha, with her eyes black as sloes, her face radiant with joy, was flying towards him, and they caught hold of each other's hands. Got stung, I dare say," she said, arranging her hair with her free hand, breathing fast and looking straight up at him with a glad, pleasant smile. "I didn't know there was a ditch here," he answered, smiling also, and keeping her hand in his. She drew nearer to him, and he himself, not knowing how it happened, stooped towards her. She didn't move away, and he pressed her hand tight and kissed her on the lips. "There, you've done it," she said, and freeing her hand with a swift movement, ran away from him. Then, breaking 2 branches of white lilac, from which the blossoms were already falling, she began fanning her hot face with them. Then, with her head turned back to him, she walked away, swaying her arms briskly in front of her, and joined the other players. After this, there grew up between Nekhludoff and Katusha those peculiar relations which often exist between a pure young man and girl who are attracted to each other. When Katusha came into the room, or even when he saw her white apron from afar, everything brightened up in Nekhludoff's eyes. As when the sun appears, everything becomes more interesting, more joyful, more important. The whole of life seemed full of gladness, and she felt the same. But it was not only Katusha's presence that had this effect on Nekhludoff. The mere thought that Katusha existed, and for her that Nekhludoff existed, had this effect. When he received an unpleasant letter from his mother, or could not get on with his essay, or felt the unreasoning sadness that young people are often subject to, he had only to remember Katusha, and that he should see her, and it all vanished. Katusha had much work to do in the house, but she managed to get a little leisure for reading, and Nekhludoff gave her Dostoevsky and Turgenev, whom he had just read himself, to read. She liked Turgenev's Lull best. They had talks at moments snatched when meeting in the passage, on the veranda or the yard, or sometimes in the room of his aunt's old servant, Matrona Pavlovna, with whom he sometimes used to drink tea, and where Katusha used to work. These talks in Matrona Pavlovna's presence were the pleasantest. When they were alone, it was worse. Their eyes at once began to say something very different and far more important than what their mouths uttered. Their lips puckered, and they felt a kind of dread of something that made them part quickly. These relations continued between Nekhludoff and Katusha during the whole time of his first visit to his aunt's. They noticed it and became frightened, and even wrote to Princess Elena Ivanovna, Nekhludoff's mother. His aunt, Mary Ivanovna, was afraid Dmitri would form an intimacy with Katusha, but her fears were groundless, for Nekhludoff, himself hardly conscious of it, loved Katusha, loved her as the pure love, and therein lay his safety, his and hers. He not only did not feel any desire to possess her, but the very thought of it filled him with horror. The fears of the more poetical Sophia Ivanovna, that Dmitri, with his thoroughgoing, resolute character, having fallen in love with a girl, might make up his mind to marry her, without considering either her birth or her station, had more ground. Had Nekhludoff at that time been conscious of his love for Katusha, and especially if he had been told that he could on no account join his life with that of a girl in her position, it might have easily happened that, with his usual straightforwardness, he would have come to the conclusion that there could be no possible reason for him not to marry any girl whatever, as long as he loved her. But his aunts did not mention their fears to him, and when he left, he was still unconscious of his love for Katusha. He was sure that what he felt for Katusha was only one of the manifestations of the joy of life that filled his whole being, and that this sweet, merry little girl shared this joy with him. Yet when he was going away, and Katusha stood with his aunts in the porch and looked after him, her dark, slightly squinting eyes filled with tears, he felt, after all, that he was leaving something beautiful, precious, something which would never reoccur, and he grew very sad. "Goodbye, Katusha," he said, looking across Sophia Ivanovna's cap as he was getting into the trap. "Thank you for everything." "Goodbye, Dmitri Ivanovitch," she said with her pleasant tender voice, keeping back the tears that filled her eyes, and ran away into the hall, where she could cry in peace. End of Book 1, Chapter 12.